Bride broke a wild bull in one afternoon. Cowboys had failed for 6 months. The rope was already cut when I rode in. Not frayed, not worn through, cut. Clean. Someone had taken a blade to it at the post where we'd been tying Diablo off, and whoever did it hadn't left a note because they didn't figure they needed to. The message was the rope itself, lying in 2 pieces in the dust by the water trough, the ends still white and new-looking the way fresh-cut hemp is. I stepped down from my horse, picked up both pieces, held them together like I was trying to figure out how they'd failed. I knew they hadn't failed. I knew exactly what it meant. I'd been on the trail 6 days, coming back from Casper with a woman I'd just married, and the rope was the welcome home. Her name was Cora. Cora Fenn. She'd been Cora Aldous now, my name on her now, though it still sat strange in my mouth when I said it to myself. She was 34 years old, daughter of a dry goods man out of Laramie who'd been dead 3 years, and she'd been running his store since then in a building that leaked and a town that was shrinking. She'd answered an ad I hadn't entirely meant to place. My foreman Heck had placed it on my behalf while I was sick with a lung complaint one November, certain I was going to die and feeling the need to do something useful. I recovered. The ad had already run, and 3 letters came back. 2 of them I threw in the fire without finishing them. Cora's letter I read 4 times. She didn't say much. She wasn't pretty about it, wasn't formal. She said she knew cattle, she could cook and keep accounts. She wasn't afraid of hard work or weather, she didn't frighten at the sight of blood, and she needed to know if the man she'd be coming to was honest. That was all she asked. Was he honest? I wrote back and said I tried to be. She wrote back and said that was the right answer. A man who said yes outright wasn't. We met in April, married in May. I brought her home in June with the whole of the Aldous Range still muddy from snowmelt and Heck Faraday waiting for me at the gate with that expression on his face that told me something was wrong before he opened his mouth. But first there was the rope. I stood holding the 2 cut pieces and Cora was still on her horse behind me, sitting easy the way she sat, back straight, hands loose, watching me. I could feel her watching without turning around. She had that quality, a kind of still attention that you felt on your skin. I turned and held up both pieces so she could see. She looked at them, looked at the trough, looked at the post where they'd been tied. "That deliberate?" she asked. "Yes." She didn't say anything else. She got down off her horse herself, which she always did before I could offer, and she looped her reins over the fence rail and came to stand beside me and look at the rope ends. "Who'd be unhappy enough about something to cut a rope?" she said. "Maybe everybody," I said. She waited for more. I gave her more. The ranch was the Aldous, named for my father, who'd built the house and the first 3 outbuildings, and died before I was old enough to remember what kind of man he was, only the kind of ranch he'd left. I'd been running it 22 years. When I say running it, I mean bleeding for it. Drought years and wet years and the years the beef price died and the years you thought you were going to make it, and then you didn't quite. I'd had 9 hands at the peak of it, and I'd been down to 3, and when things turned I'd built back to 7 and held there. Good men, most of them, not men who'd expected me to bring home a wife. There was no particular reason for the hostility except the general human one, which is that men who have worked a place long enough start to feel like it's partly theirs, and a new woman is a change they didn't vote for. Heck had been with me 16 years. Walt Orris, 12. The others shorter, but still long enough that they'd put themselves in the ground of this place in some way they couldn't fully explain and wouldn't try to. And I'd gone and married a woman none of them had met, brought her home on the back of my judgment alone, and they were going to let me know what they thought of that. Cut rope was a mild opening. I told Cora this without looking at her, still studying the post. She listened. Then she said, "Is the bull actually unbreakable, or have they just failed?" That brought me around. "What?" "You told me about the bull on the 2nd day, the one they've been trying to work for 6 months. I had told her. I told her a lot of things in the 6 days between Casper and here, because there was nothing to do on a long ride but talk, and I was out of the habit of it, and she'd pulled it out of me without seeming to try. Diablo was a 4-year-old black Hereford cross we'd taken in trade for a debt owed to me by a man named Coulter who ran a small outfit east of us. The bull was enormous, broad-chested, close to 1.5 tons when we weighed him, and he was also the most dangerous animal on the property. 3 men had been hurt trying to work him. One of them, a boy named Pate who'd been with me 8 months, had his shoulder broken. We kept trying because the bull's breeding was exceptional and every calf he threw was worth good money, but he couldn't be reliably handled, couldn't be moved without a full team, couldn't be trusted near any of the hands. Heck had told me twice that we should sell him on before someone got killed. I'd put it off because I'm stubborn, and because I hated to admit that an animal had beaten us. Cora had asked about him the second day, and I'd told her the shape of it. She'd listened and asked a few specific questions I hadn't known quite how to answer, because they were questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. He's not unbreakable, I told her now. No bull is. We just haven't figured the right way. You've been going at him from the front. Every man on this place has gone at him from the front, yes. She looked at the rope ends in my hands. What's his pen like? I described the pen. She asked about the size, the gate placement, whether there was shade, whether we'd ever tried working him in the morning cold rather than the afternoon heat. I answered each one. Then she said, "Let me try him." I looked at her, she looked back. She wasn't smiling and she wasn't challenging me, she was just saying a thing she meant. "You've worked cattle your father's whole life," I said. "I grew up on a cattleman's ranch before my father moved into goods." "Yes." "Your father was a dry goods man." "He was a cattleman first." "I've told you that." She had, I'd heard it and stored it without fully understanding what it meant. I understand now what it's dangerous to assume you understand a person from what they tell you about themselves, because the words a person uses to describe their life are always smaller than the life itself. Cora had said cattleman's ranch, and I'd pictured a small operation, a girl watching from fences, not a girl doing the work. That was my mistake. "After we've been inside 5 minutes," I said. She nodded, but she was still looking at the bull pen in the middle distance, and something in the set of her jaw told me she'd already started thinking about it. Heck was on the porch when we came up to the house. He had his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has worked out a greeting and rehearsed it and is now finding it fits poorly. He was 60 years old, thin as a wire fence post, with a white mustache he'd had since before I knew him. He looked at Cora for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he's already decided about, then he looked at me. "Welcome back," he said to me. "Heck," I said, "this is Cora." Heck put his hat on, which was a way of not extending his hand. "Ma'am," he said. Cora looked at him level. "You're Heck Faraday," she said. "Caleb's talked about you. He says you're the best judge of a horse he's ever known." Heck's face shifted, just barely, around the eyes. He hadn't expected to be talked about, and he hadn't expected it to be said with that particular plainness, no butter on it, just a fact she was reporting. "That's kind," he said. "He also says you've been putting off telling him the bull ought to go, because you know he doesn't want to hear it." That one landed. Heck looked at me, surprised, not angry, the look of a man being told he's been seen clearly from a distance. I kept my face still. "The bull's a problem," Heck said carefully. "I'd like to try him tomorrow morning," Cora said. "Early, before the heat, I'll need the pen to myself." Heck looked at me again. This time the look was asking something. "Tell the men," I said. Heck put his hat back off his head and stood holding it again, and I could see him recalculating something. I didn't know what yet. I'd know by morning. The house smelled of disuse. 6 days is enough time for a house to start smelling like no one lives in it. A kind of flat, closed-in dryness that gets into the curtains. Cora walked through the main room without stopping and went into the kitchen, and I heard her open the back door to move some air through, then heard the creak of the pump. I stood in the middle of my own living room with my trail coat still on and the cut rope in my coat pocket, where I'd put it without thinking, and I felt the strangeness of it, having a woman in this house, filling the quiet of it with ordinary sounds. My wife had been dead 11 years. Her name was Agnes, and I don't intend to talk about her at length because that's not the shape of this story, but I will say that when she died, I stopped expecting the house to sound like anything. And after a few years, you stop hearing the absence the way you used to, and it just becomes the texture of the place. Now I heard a pump working and the knock of a cabinet door, and it felt like a change in the pressure of the air. Cora came back through carrying a lamp she'd found somewhere. "Your kitchen's clean," she said. "Someone's kept it." Heck's wife, she comes twice a week. "I'll need to meet her." "She'll want to meet you." Cora set the lamp down and looked at me. Not like a woman studying a new thing, like a woman taking stock of what she already knows and checking it against the original. I had the feeling she'd been doing that since Casper, and that the results were so far satisfactory, which was not a feeling I was used to having about myself. "They're going to make it hard," she said, not asking. "Probably. The cut rope, that's the softest thing it'll be. Likely." She looked around the room, at the walls, the window, the corner where a rifle hung on 2 wooden pegs. "Do you want me to pretend not to notice?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "All right," she said, and picked up the lamp again and went to find the bedroom. I stood there another minute, coat still on, listening to her move through the house. Then I took the cut rope out of my pocket and dropped it in the kindling box by the door and went to find her. Walt Orris was the one who left the rope. I found this out the next morning, not because anyone told me, but because Walt was the only man on the property who carried a folding knife sharp enough to make that cut. He was 55, a Texan, had been driving cattle since before I was born, and he'd come to me 12 years ago after his own outfit failed, and I'd never had a better stockman. He was not a man who said much. The rope was him saying something. I found him at the horse barn before sunrise, checking shoes on a Grulla mare we'd been having trouble with. "Walt," I said. He kept his attention on the hoof he was holding. "Caleb." "The rope." He set the hoof down easy and straightened and looked at me. His eyes were pale, almost gray, with that flat distance that some men who have worked outside their whole lives develop, like the long sight lines have pushed the focus of their eyes out permanently. "I didn't know you'd see it that way," he said. "How did you think I'd see it?" He didn't answer that right away. He picked up the Grulla's next leg and bent over it. "She's somebody's widow," he said. "No. She done this before, come out to a working place. She was raised on one." Walt made a sound that wasn't a word. He set the leg down and moved to the last hoof. I waited. "You marry quick," he said finally. "I married when it was right. You didn't ask nobody." "I didn't need to ask nobody." He looked at me over the horse's back then, and there was something in it I didn't quite understand yet. Not hostility, or not only, something else underneath. "You been alone 11 years, he said. "I know how long I've been alone." "A man gets," he stopped, started again. "It's easy to decide wrong when you've been alone a long time." I held on to what I wanted to say and took my time with what I was going to say instead. "She asked me in a letter if I was honest," I said. "I told her I tried to be. She came out here on the strength of that." Walt smoothed his hand along the mare's flank, not looking at me. "She's going to try the bull this morning," I said. He looked up sharp. "Alone early." Before heat, I watched his face. She asked about him first thing, right away, soon as we rode in. Something moved behind Walt's eyes, a question being formed that he didn't put words to. He straightened up, the mare done, and hung the hoof pick on the wall. "She'll get hurt," he said, not mean. Factual the way Walt said most things. "Could be," I said. "She knows the risk." He looked at his hands, then at me. "That your judgment? Let her go at him." "That's her choice," I said. "She's a grown woman." Walt had no answer for that. He went back to the Grulla, ran a palm down her neck, eyes down. I left him there. The other men I told at breakfast. There were 5 of them at the table: Walt, Heck, young Pate, whose shoulder was healed but who still held it slightly different when he sat, and 2 brothers named Cy and Doyle Fisk who'd come on in the spring and were still finding out what the Aldous was like. Cora had cooked. She'd been up before me, which I hadn't expected, and there was a proper breakfast on the table, proper meaning not just food but thought, a thing made with intention rather than thrown together. The biscuits were right. The eggs had something in them I couldn't name. Coffee was strong. The men ate mostly without looking at her. She ate with them and didn't force conversation, just sat and ate and looked out the window at the color coming into the sky. When they were nearly done, I said, "Cora's going to try the bull this morning." No one said anything for a moment. Pate looked up with something sharp and immediate in his face, not quite fear but close to it, a man who'd been broken by a thing and didn't want to watch someone else learn the same way. Cy and Doyle Fisk looked at each other. Heck looked at his coffee. Walt said quietly, "She know what he did to Pate." "I've told her," I said. "I told her myself," Cora said. She was looking at Pate now, directly, not the way most people look at someone who's been injured, not with that soft, lowered thing that can feel like pity, but straight, the way you look at a man. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "That was a bad situation handled in a bad way, and I don't intend to do it the same way." Pate looked back at her. Something changed in his face, the wariness shifting to something I couldn't quite name. "He's fast," he said. "Faster than you'd expect from a bull that size." "Where does he go first?" she said. "When he charges, where does he go?" Pate blinked. "What?" "Which direction? Does he hook left, hook right? Does he lead with his head down, or does he drop it at the last second?" Pate had never been asked this. I could see him sorting through the memory of a moment he'd spent 11 months trying not to think about in detail. "He drops it," he said slowly. "Last second. You think he's going to come in high and then he drops." She nodded, filing it. "That's useful." "Thank you." Pate didn't say "you're welcome." He just kept looking at her in that same changed way. The Fisk brothers were watching her with something closer to plain interest now, the thing they'd been holding away from, the curiosity of men who hadn't decided yet whether to be hostile or impressed. Heck still hadn't looked up, but his hand around his coffee cup had loosened. After breakfast, I walked her to the pen. The pen was a hard-packed dirt oval, maybe 60 feet across, with a solid rail fence that we'd reinforced twice since bringing Diablo in. The bull was at the far end when we came up. Black, enormous, the kind of size that doesn't quite register right until you're close to it, and then registers too much. He was standing still in the early shade, head low, watching us the way he watched everything, with that particular bovine stillness that contains something that is not patience and not calm. Cora stood at the rail and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. I stood beside her and didn't say anything either. The bull swung his head slowly. His horns were not long, but they were thick at the base, and when he moved them you could feel the weight of them in your imagination, the physics of what they would do if they connected. Heck had clocked him from standstill to full charge in something under 2 seconds when Pate got hurt. 2 seconds is not much. "How's he been fed?" she said. "Same as the others." "I mean who brings it the way it's done?" "I thought." "Heck mostly, throws it over the rail from outside, doesn't go in." "Smart," she said, "but that's why he's still wild. He's been fed through a fence his whole time here. He's learned that everything on the outside of the fence is separate from him. There's no relationship." She paused. "Has anyone talked to him?" I looked at her. "I mean regularly. The way you talk to a horse that needs gentling. Consistently, same voice, same time, so he learns the sound of a person as something other than a threat or nothing at all." "We haven't done that," I said. "No," she said, "you haven't." She said it without blame, just marking what was true. "He's not mean," she added. "He's alone, there's a difference." I looked at Diablo. He was still watching us, head still low. I thought about what she said about alone, and I thought, without wanting to, about 11 years of a house that made no sound. "What do you need?" I said. "An hour," she said. "Just me in there. No men at the fence, no one watching from the barn. He can hear better than you think, and he reads crowd differently than he reads one person. I want him to have to deal with just one thing. If he charges, the fence is close enough that I can get over it." She turned and looked at me then, and in the early light her face had a steadiness in it that I recognized from somewhere I hadn't been in a long time. Conviction, maybe, or something older than conviction. The look of a person who has thought a thing all the way through to its end before they started. "I know what I'm doing, Caleb," she said. "I'm not reckless, I'm not going to get hurt." The thing about a woman you've known 3 months saying, "I know what I'm doing," is that you haven't had enough time to know whether she does. The thing about that particular woman saying it was that she'd been right about everything else she'd said with that same flat certainty, and so you had the beginning of a record, and the record said trust her. "1 hour," I said. She went through the gate. I went to the barn and I told the men to stay clear, and then I went up to the hay loft by myself where there was a small window facing the pen, and I watched. I'm not going to pretend I didn't watch. She'd asked the men to stay away, and I'd told the men to stay away, and I stayed away as far as the men could see, but I was watching. Maybe that was wrong. I've thought about it since, and I don't think it was. I think there's a difference between watching the person you've taken responsibility for in a dangerous situation and interfering with what they're doing. I was watching in case I needed to move, and I didn't intend to move unless it became clearly necessary, which is a harder line to hold than it sounds when the person out there is your wife. She walked in and closed the gate behind her and stood still. Diablo was at the far end. He'd seen her come in, he tracked everything, but he didn't move. He stood the way he always stood, that enormous, patient, angry stillness, and he watched her. She didn't look at him directly. That was the first thing I noticed. She turned slightly sideways, not away, not fully toward him, but at an angle, and she looked at the ground between them or at the air somewhere in the middle distance. Not the way a frightened person looks away, but deliberately, a choice in her body language that was a kind of communication. She started talking. I couldn't hear the words from the loft. What I could hear was the sound of it, the register, the rhythm. Low, even unhurried. The way you talked to someone who'd been sleeping and you needed them to stay asleep. Not whispering, but quiet, continuous, without the rises and drops that normal conversation has. Almost like reading aloud to yourself. She didn't raise it when Diablo shifted or swung his head. She kept it exactly the same. She moved after a while, not toward him, in a slow arc that would eventually take her to the middle of the pen, like she was interested in the fence on the other side and just happened to be passing through his world. She was still talking. She paused once to pick up a handful of dirt and rub it between her palms, which I didn't understand, and then she let it fall and kept moving, and I understood. She'd put dirt smell on herself. A ground smell, animal neutral, the smell of the pen itself rather than the smell of a person. Diablo had stopped watching her with his whole face. He was watching her sideways, the way prey animals watch when they're curious about something but not ready to decide if it's a threat. His tail was loose. Not up, which was aggression, just hanging, which was the absence of it. She stopped at the middle of the pen. She put her back to him, fully turned away, looking at the gate, and kept talking, and she crouched down so that she was low, folded down close to the dirt like she was looking at something in it. Diablo took a step. I put my hand flat on the barn wall without meaning to. He took another, slow one leg then the others, the enormous mass of him shifting with a kind of reluctant gravity. He was not charging. He was moving the way an animal moves when it can't help itself, when something has called it forward against its own suspicion. She didn't move, she kept talking. She had her face turned slightly to the side, not looking back at him, but I could see from her shoulders that she knew exactly where he was, that she was tracking him by sound and peripheral awareness, the way you track something you can't afford to spook by looking at it directly. He stopped about 15 feet behind her. He put his head down and blew air out through his nose, not a charge warning, different, the sound a bull makes when it's smelling something it's trying to understand. His eyes were on her. She turned around, slow even. She sat cross-legged on the dirt and she looked at him. Not challenge, not submission, just looked at him with an easiness that I would not have been able to produce in that moment, with 1.5 tons of hostile animal 15 feet away. He looked back. They stayed like that. I don't know how long. Time in a hay loft watching something that might at any moment become very bad is not the same as regular time. It could have been 10 minutes. It felt like longer than any 10 minutes I'd had in recent memory. He took another step, then another. He stopped at 7 feet, maybe 6, close enough that I could see his breath move in the morning air, a small fog from his nostrils in the cold. He was still looking at her. She raised one hand, slow. Palm up, not extended toward him, but tilted up, the way you offer something to a dog that's not sure yet if it wants to come. She kept talking. His head came down a little. Down is not the drop-hand charge that Pate described. Down is a loosening. Down is the posture of an animal that is, against its own nature and its long experience of men, beginning to think about the possibility of something different. He stepped forward and put his nose to her palm. I let out the breath I'd been holding so long I'd stopped knowing I was holding it. She let him smell her hand for a long time. She kept talking to him. Then, and I saw this clearly from the loft, she moved her hand slowly up and touched the side of his face, the broad, flat place below his eye. He didn't move. She kept her hand there, talking to him, and after a while she stood up, slow, steady, no fast movement anywhere, and she put both hands on either side of his great head and she looked at him. He stood still. She started moving, slowly with her hands on his face, turning slightly, guiding his head, and he went with it, enormous, heavy, following the pressure of her hands with the docile attention of an animal that has decided, for reasons of its own, to try this. She walked him in a slow circle. He went. Then she stopped and she stepped back, and she said something that made him put his head up and blow air again. And for a second it looked like it might go wrong, but she stepped sideways, not back, and she waited. and he put his head down and snorted again and then settled. She looked up at the loft window. She hadn't known I was there as far as I could tell, but she found me. She found me the way she found things, by looking where she thought the thing she was looking for might be and being right. She held my gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to the bull. I don't know when the men came. I was still in the loft when I heard a voice below me, and then another, and I looked down through a gap in the boards and saw Heck standing just outside the barn with his hands in his pockets, looking toward the pen. Then Walt came up beside him. They didn't speak to each other. They just stood there looking. Cy and Doyle Fisk came around from the other side of the barn and stopped short when they saw what was in the pen. Cy said something I couldn't hear. Doyle said something back. Then they both went quiet. Pate came last. He stopped at a distance from the others, the way he did most things since the injury, slightly separate, as if proximity to the group was something he had to earn back. He looked at the pen. I watched his face from above, and I watched it go through several things in sequence, the way a face does when it's processing something that contradicts a thing it's held for a long time. What they were seeing, Cora walking Diablo on a lead rope she'd taken from the fence rail where we kept halters. Not fighting him, not dragging him, walking with him the way you walk with an animal that knows you, that has chosen to go where you're going. She'd gotten the halter on him. I hadn't seen how. I'd been watching his head and missed the moment. And she was walking him in a wide circle around the pen, talking, her hand on his neck occasionally, and he was going. Walt stood with his arms crossed, and I couldn't see his eyes from up here, but I could see the set of his body, which was different from the set it usually had. There was something in the stillness of him that was not stubbornness anymore. A man rethinking a position he's held for a long time doesn't do it with any fanfare, and Walt was not a fanfare man. But I've known him long enough to know his body, and his body was revising something. Heck reached up and took his hat off, which he only did when he was thinking hard. I came down from the loft. When I walked out of the barn, Heck looked at me and didn't say anything, which from Heck was considerable. Walt had still not uncrossed his arms, but he looked at me now, and his face had that pale, flat look he got when he was being honest, which was different from when he was being polite. "Where'd she learn that?" Pate said. He was behind us, closer than I'd expected, and his voice had changed from the flat, careful tone he'd used at breakfast. There was something open in it. "Her father's ranch," I said, "before the store." Pate was quiet. Then she knew about dropping his head. "She asked you about it." "I know she asked. I'm saying she already knew. She asked me to confirm it." He paused. She was testing whether she could trust what I said. I looked at him. He was watching the pen still. "Probably," I said. He nodded slowly. Something settled in his face that had been unsettled for a long time. Cora came out of the pen about 20 minutes later. She'd rehaltered Diablo to the post inside the pen, different post than before, one she'd said the placement of the original was wrong, too close to the gate, too exposed, and she'd done it easily, the way you do something you've done 100 times. She pulled the gate closed and turned and came toward us across the yard, and she had dirt on her knees from when she'd crouched, and a thin smear of something along her left forearm, probably from when she'd first put her hands on his face, and her hair had come loose on one side and she hadn't fixed it. The men were all there. All 6 of them come without being summoned, which told me something. She walked up to them without slowing down and stopped a few feet from Heck. "He needs to be worked twice a day," she said to Heck. "Same time, same person, same approach. He'll be workable within a month if you're consistent. He's not a bad animal, he's a confused one." Heck turned his hat in his hands. He looked at her, he looked at me, he looked back at her. "Could have been done in 6 months," he said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard from Heck, which was a note of self-assessment, not warm and not hard, just honest. "Different people kept trying," she said. "That's the problem. He needs to learn one person first." "Who?" Heck said. "You," she said without hesitating. "You're the most patient man on this place, and the bull can read that. He just needs to know you're not afraid of him." Heck's face opened in a way I'd seen it do maybe 3 times in 16 years. Not a smile, not quite. Heck's face didn't make smiles cheaply, but something close to it, something that started around the eyes. He put his hat back on. Walt uncrossed his arms. It was such a small thing, such a quiet physical thing, but I felt it the way you feel a shift in weather, the pressure changing before you can see the sky changing. He put his arms down at his sides, thumbs hooked in his belt, and he looked at Cora and he said, You want coffee." She looked at him, then at me just for a second, and I saw in her face that she understood what had just happened as well as I did, and that she was choosing not to make anything of it, not to acknowledge the shift in a way that would embarrass Walt or anyone. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Walt." He went. The others drifted back to their work in the way men do when the thing they came to see is over, and they're not going to say what they thought about it. Pate caught my eye as he turned to go and gave me a look I'd seen him give horses he'd finally gotten right. A look that said the work was harder than I expected, and it's better than I expected, both at once. I stood there in the yard with the early sun coming over the barn roof, and the dust from the pen settling, and the sound of the ranch going back to its ordinary sounds, and I looked at my wife. She was looking at the pen, at Diablo, still now, calmer at the post than I'd ever seen him. She had her hands loose at her sides, and she was just looking. "Thank you," I said. She turned, looked at me the way she sometimes looked at me, the thorough way, like she was taking me in and not finding anything yet that surprised her. "For what?" "For the way you handled it, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the yard and moved the loose side of her hair, and she didn't push it back. "Caleb," she said, "they didn't need me to prove anything to them. They needed to see that you knew what you were doing." I didn't understand what she meant right away. "The man who picked me," she said. "That's what they needed to see, not that I was worth keeping, that you knew enough to bring home someone worth keeping." She looked at me the way she had from the pen floor, level and clear. "And you did." I stood with that for a minute. The sun was warming the top of the barn now, and the shadows in the yard were long and going longer as the angle changed. I'd been on this land 22 years and known every morning of it, and this particular morning was different from all of them in a way I couldn't have said in words, or wouldn't, but felt in the chest, in the way you feel things that are true in the body before the mind gets to them. "I'll cut a new rope for the trough," I said. She laughed, a real one, short, not performed, the laugh of a person who didn't laugh all the time, and so when it came it was the real thing. "Leave it," she said. "Let Walt cut the new one." I looked at her. "He'll want to," she said. "Let him." That evening Walt cut a new rope and tied it at the trough without being asked. He did it the way he did everything, with no comment and no acknowledgement that it was a gesture, just a thing done and done properly. The ends worked and sealed against fraying. I came around the corner of the barn when he was just finishing, and he looked up at me, and I looked at him. "Good rope," I said. "Double the braid," he said. "Stronger than the last." He walked past me back to the barn, and I stood by the trough a moment and ran the end of the rope between my fingers. The work was clean. Walt had always done clean work. That was one of the reasons I'd kept him 12 years and intended to keep him 12 more. The house was lit when I came in that evening. That sounds simple. It sounds like nothing. But 11 years of coming into a house that is dark except for what you lit yourself had done something to me I hadn't fully known about, the way you don't fully know about a chronic ache until it stops. The lamp was going in the kitchen window, and I could smell something cooking from 30 feet out, and I stood in the yard for a moment before I went in, just holding the fact of it. Cora was at the stove. She'd changed her clothes from the morning, and she'd done something with her hair, and she had a cut on her right hand that she'd wrapped with a piece of cloth, which I noticed when she turned around. "What happened to your hand?" I said. "Gate latch," she said. "The angle's wrong, it catches if you're not careful." I went to the drawer where we kept bandaging and came back, and she let me look at it. It was not deep, more a catch than a cut, the skin raised and red but not needing more than she'd already done. I held her hand in both of mine and looked at it, and she let me, standing still, and when I looked up she was watching my face. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are." She let her hand stay in mine for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. I sat at the table and watched her cook, and I thought about what she'd said in the yard. The man who picked me, that's what they needed to see. I thought about it in the way you think about something that has rearranged something in you slightly, shifted a thing you'd carried a particular way for years. I'd spent a long time not thinking about whether I was the kind of man who made good choices, because in my experience thinking too much about that question just leads to paralysis, and the ranch needed things done. I'd gone one foot in front of the other for 22 years, and called it living, and mostly it had worked, and the things that hadn't worked I'd carried without examining too closely. She'd looked at my choices and found them sound. That was what she'd said. Not that she was glad to be here, not that she loved the place. Both of those might come in time and might not. But that the man who'd made the choices that led to her being here was a man worth making choices with. I don't know what a younger man would have done with that. I know what I did. I sat at the table in my own kitchen with the sound of cooking in the air and the lamp going and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Something that was partly gratitude and partly a kind of grief for the years that had gone without it, and mostly something else entirely. Some quiet, deep rightness that I didn't want to name in case naming it made it smaller. We ate and talked. She asked about the south pasture and I told her about it, the wet corner, the fence we'd been needing to redo. She asked about the cattle we'd have at market in the fall and I laid it out for her. The count, the weight estimates, what we'd need to bring in to get through winter. She listened the way she listened, completely, with questions that were specific and showed she'd been thinking, and she made suggestions in that flat, certain way she had that were either things I'd already thought of or things I hadn't. After dinner, she stood at the window for a while looking out at the dark. The moon was coming up behind the hills, just the beginning of it, and the yard was gray-blue and still. "The Fisk boys," she said. "Cy and Doyle." Cy asked me 3 questions this afternoon. I waited. About the bull, about whether I'd worked animals back east, about my father's place. She paused. "He wasn't hostile, he was trying to place me." "That's Cy," I said. "He needs to know where things belong." "He's young. 22, Doyle's 24. "They'll be fine," she said, "both of them." I believed her. She had the same quality about people that she had about animals, a way of reading them that wasn't magic, just attention sustained longer than most people managed. She'd been here one day. She knew Cy and Doyle would be fine. "What about Heck?" I said. She turned from the window. "Heck's been taking care of your place since before you were ready to admit you needed someone taking care of it," she said. "He'll be fine, too. He was fine at dinner." He had been. He'd talked more at dinner than I'd heard him talk in months. About the Grella mare, about a fence issue in the north section, about a horse trader he'd heard was coming through in August. He directed roughly half of it at Cora, which from Heck was an extraordinary amount of speech directed at a new person. "Pate," I said. She was quiet. The moon was higher now, more of it. "Pate is carrying more than the shoulder," she said carefully. "He's carrying the failure, of not having broken the bull himself, of having been hurt by a thing he believes he should have been able to handle." She paused. "That's going to take longer than a day." "Do you know how to help that?" She looked at me. "Give him something he can do that's hard and let him do it. Don't make it easy for him. Don't soften the thing." She looked back at the window. "He needs to be needed again." I thought about that. I thought about Pate's face when she'd asked him about the bull, the way he'd come back into himself a little, answering her question the way a man comes back into himself when someone asks him something that treats him as an expert in his own experience. "You thought about all of this today," I said. "I think about the people around me," she said. "It's not a skill, it's just attention." I went and stood beside her at the window. The yard was fully moonlit now, the barn and the outbuildings all in that flat silver, the fence rails casting thin shadows on the ground. The bull pen was quiet, Diablo a dark shape against the far fence. "He'll be all right too," she said. "Meaning the bull, he'll be what he's supposed to be." I looked at the dark shape of him. "What's he supposed to be?" "Valuable," she said. "Functional, part of the place instead of a problem on it." She looked at me sideways. "That's what most things need, just to be part of something instead of outside it." I held that. The moon moved a fraction. I could hear the wind in the grass beyond the fence, a low, continuous sound, the same sound this land made every clear night, the same sound it had made before I was here and would make after. "Cora," I said. She looked at me. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I mean for answering the letter, for deciding to come." She was quiet for a moment. The window glass was cold enough now that her breath made a faint film on it. "Your letter said you tried to be honest," she said. "I wanted to find out what a man who said that looked like." She looked at me straight, the way she did everything straight level with that full attention. "You look like what I thought." I didn't have an answer for that. I put my arm around her shoulders, and she stood against me and looked out at the yard. And we stood like that while the moon finished coming up and the ranch went dark and quiet around us. And I felt the weight of her against my side. Solid, real, not soft the way that sounds, but real. The weight of a person who has chosen to be where they are. And I thought about the word honest and what I'd meant by it when I wrote it, trying to tell the truth about myself in a letter to a woman I'd never met. Hoping it would be enough. It had been enough. 6 days later, Walt worked the bull for the first time. He went in the same way Cora had shown him, quiet, sideways, low voice, and Diablo tried him once, a short forward movement that wasn't quite a charge, and Walt held his ground and kept talking, and after about 40 minutes he had his hand on the animal's neck. He didn't tell me about it. I heard it from Pate, who'd been watching from the fence. Pate's voice when he told me was still that careful voice he'd been using since the injury, but there was something in it that wasn't quite so careful as it had been. Walt didn't flinch, Pate said. Bull came at him and he just stood. Walt's steadier than he looks, I said. Pate was quiet. Then I ran, he said. When he came at me, I turned and ran, and that's when he caught me. I looked at him. He was looking at the ground. You did the right thing, I said. I know, but he stopped, tried again. I just want to go back in there, he said. When I'm ready, not now, but eventually. Walt'll show you, I said, when you're ready. He nodded. He went back to work. The shoulder sat a little different than it had at breakfast. I went and found Cora. She was in the kitchen going through the account books I'd left in a drawer for 2 years, catching up what had fallen behind while I was alone and not seeing the point. She had the books open on the table, and she'd found the errors I'd let accumulate, and she wasn't angry about them, just fixing them, working through it the way she worked through everything, steady, thorough, complete. I put my hand on the back of her neck, where her hair was pulled up, and she reached up without looking and put her hand over mine. Walt did it, I said. I knew he would, she said. Pate wants to try eventually. I know, she said. I talked to him this morning. I stood there with my hand under hers and the account books open on the table, and the afternoon light coming in the window at the angle it came in at this time of year. The particular yellow of late-day High Plains light that I'd been seeing every day for 22 years. And I thought about the fact that she was here in it now. In the light I'd been seeing alone, in the house I'd been in alone, at the table I'd been sitting at alone, and that her hand was on mine in a way that meant she chose it, not out of necessity. Not because she had nowhere else, but because she'd read the letter and found the man and decided. That was the whole of it. That was what I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting, all those years of running the ranch and going one foot in front of the other, and not asking too much of life, because life had already taken a lot. A person who saw what you were and chose it. A woman who walked into a pen with an animal that had broken men and came out with her hand on his face, and looked up at the loft window and found you, because she'd figured out where you'd be. That was the word for it, if there had to be one. Found. The account books took Cora a week. The fence in the north section took Cy and Doyle 3 days, and they did it right, which I knew because I'd watched Cy the second day, and he was taking the same care with the posts that Walt did, which meant he'd been watching Walt, which meant he was learning the place. Heck worked the bull every morning at the same time, going in quiet, talking hands easy. By the 3rd week, Diablo would come to him at the fence. By the end of the month, Heck could walk him without the lead, and Diablo followed at his shoulder like a horse following a man it's decided to respect. The whole operation changed. Not because one thing happened and everything was suddenly different, but because that's not how things change on a ranch. Things change on a ranch by accumulation, each day adding a little to the day before, until one day you look around and the shape of everything is different from what it used to be, and you can't point to the moment it turned. What I can point to is Heck's hat coming off in his hands the first morning, Walt's arms uncrossing, Pate asking a question that was also an answer. The Fisk boys watching a woman walk a bull in circles and deciding, without saying it, that the place they'd come to was better than they'd known. I can point to Cora in the door of the barn in August, sun behind her, talking to Pate about something that had him nodding and standing straight for the first time since I'd known him with the injury. I didn't hear what she said. I didn't need to. I can point to the dinner table in September when all 7 of us were around it, which had never happened in my memory of this place. The table was only big enough for 5, and Cora had the 2 Fisk boys build a leaf for it, and they'd built it square and strong, which was not surprising because everything the Fisk boys built once they stopped being uncertain was square and strong, and there was noise at that table, real noise. Talking over each other and the scrape of chairs, and the sound of things being passed. I sat at the head of it and watched my ranch and thought about my father, who'd built the house and built the table, and thought he would have known her. I can point to an evening in October when the first cold had come in, and we were sitting by the fire, and she was reading a letter from her cousin in Laramie, and I was looking at the fire, and she said, without looking up, "You're worried about the East herd." I looked at her. "How do you know?" "The way you're looking at the fire," she said. I thought about the East herd. I was worried about the East herd. There was a pasture question I'd been turning over for 2 weeks and hadn't said aloud. "The East pasture drainage problem," I said. "The wet corner," she said. "Yes," she turned a page. "I've been thinking about it. Cy says there's a drainage ditch on the Coulter side that was blocked years ago, if we cleared it." "You talked to Cy about the drainage?" "I talked to Cy about a lot of things," she said. "He notices things, he just doesn't always know what to do with what he's noticed." She looked up. "He's going to be a good hand in 2 more years, maybe the best you've had." I looked at the fire. Outside the wind was going and the cold was set in hard, and the ranch was dark and quiet the way it got in October when the work slowed, and you could hear the land again. Inside there was fire and light, and a woman reading a letter and the smell of the evening's dinner still in the air. "You think about everything," I said. "Somebody ought to," she said, and went back to the letter. That winter was hard. 3 weeks of cold that kept the cattle close and meant extra work from everybody. And there was a week in January when the well pump froze, and we were carrying water by hand, and Doyle Fisk got a bad cold that went into his chest and kept him in his bunk for 4 days. And there was a night when the wind was so bad I could hear it in the timbers of the house like a sound the house was making itself. Not the regular creak and settle of an old building, but something lower and bigger. The sound of something leaning into force and holding. Cora was up before me most mornings that winter. I would hear her in the kitchen, the stove being loaded, the particular sound of the coldest kind of morning, everything slower, stiffer, the sounds of the house reluctant. I would lie in the dark for a minute and listen, and then I would get up. One morning in February I came into the kitchen, and she was standing at the window with both hands around a coffee cup, looking out at the yard. The snow had come overnight, 3 or 4 inches, and everything was white and still, the kind of stillness that only snow makes, absorbing sound. She was still in her coat. She'd been out already, which she did some mornings. I don't know why, maybe because she needed the outside before she could be inside. She was looking at Diablo's pen. "He's fine," she said before I asked. "I know," I said. "Heck checked him last night." She turned from the window. There was a redness in her face from the cold that would be gone in 10 minutes, and she had snow in her hair from whatever she'd been doing outside, a few small flakes of it going to water in the warmth. She looked at me across the kitchen with that look she sometimes had in the mornings, clear and awake and close, like the sleep had stripped away whatever she carried in public and left the plain version. "You happy here?" she said. It was a strange question. We'd been here together 7 months by then. I looked at her and I thought about the question seriously, which is the only way she ever asked things and the only way she expected to have them answered. "Yes," I said, "you." She looked at the window, looked back at me. "Yes," she said. She handed me the coffee cup and I drank from it, which was a thing she sometimes did, offered rather than poured a second. Just shared the one, which was practical and also not only practical. And I stood at the window beside her and looked at the snow. The ranch was white and still, and the bullpen was quiet, and the barn was standing solid the way it had stood through every winter of the 22 years I'd been here, and the years before that I hadn't. Cora stood beside me close, her shoulder against mine, and we drank the coffee back and forth and watched the snow. I thought about honest. I thought about trying to be. I thought about a letter written by a man who wasn't sure anymore what he had to offer, and a woman who'd asked the right question about it, and gotten the right answer and come. I thought about the rope in 2 pieces in the dust, and the rope that replaced it, doubled and sealed. The sun came up behind the hills, and the snow lit up the way snow does when it first hits light, everything sharp and clean and a little blinding. I put my arm around her and she didn't move toward me or away, just stood the way she stood, solid, present, her weight against mine. The ranch went quiet in the snow, everything settled. I had everything I needed, right there in that window, and I'd known it for months, and I knew it now harder. That was enough.